Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. Introducing our next speaker, we have Rotem Petranker. Rotem is a clinical psychology PhD student at York University and is the Associate Director of Center for Psychedelic Studies at the University of Toronto. Rotem, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Psyched.
All right, can you hear me? This thing on?
Yep, we can hear you.
Sweet. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Pretty excited to talk to everyone today. My name is Rotem, as Marek said. And also, I want to say a big thank you also to Brian's talk. That was really interesting. And I think that I'm actually going to touch on some similar themes on this talk. So let's get into it. So today I'm going to talk to you about microdosing as a potential response to the meaning crisis. This is a brand new talk, just from a couple papers that are currently under review. So I'm excited to talk about these new findings for the very first time. So just in terms of the outline of this talk, I'll just give you my working definition of what microdosing is and talk a little bit about science in general and specifically in psychedelics and the way I think it is important we do it. And then I'll jump into results from the Global Drug Survey from last year, which are currently being reviewed by the Journal of Psychopharmacology. And then results from another qualitative analysis that we ran. And then finally, I'll go into some future directions of where we intend to take this enterprise. So first of all, in terms of what is microdosing, I'm sure everyone's heard about it. We were interested in specifically LSD and psilocybin or magic mushrooms in our study. And because there's no really obvious hard and fast rule for what a microdose is. And we think that there may be variability between individuals too. We decided to just, go with kind of a broad definition. So for LSD, it's up to 20 micrograms or 10% of a tab. And for dried mushrooms, it's up to 0.3 grams. So roughly 10% of what we would consider to be a recreational dose. I know that different people use different amounts, but this is what we decided on as a cutoff. And we just tried to keep it consistent between studies so that we can compare our various findings. So now that we know kind of what microdosing is, and I'm sure that you've heard from a lot of people about what microdosing can do for them, the next step would be to look at these anecdotes, right? So, and we got so many anecdotes, like people are saying, these are all real. When I microdose, I seem to be able to understand things the first time I read them much more often. Or I started my microdosing experiment with psilocybin mushrooms and therein got relief from depression and alcoholism. Or microdosing reduced my migraines about 80%. These all look really promising, really exciting, but these are just anecdotes, right? And what we're trying to do here is science. We're trying to take all these anecdotes and come up with what are the actual trends that are going on so that we can, in the future, run an actual clinical trial to try and assess all these, I guess, purported benefits of microdosing. But before we can jump into the science, I think it's important that we talk about how to do science. And I think that this is particularly important for psychedelics. I'm not going to talk very much about the replication crisis, which currently a bunch of disciplines are facing, including psychology, biology, medical science. The issue is that just in a nutshell, a lot of what people were doing in the past was not as rigorous as it should have been. And there's a way to try and do things right this time around. And so the way we do that is by practicing open science. I'm sure people have heard about Bob Jesse's initiative for open science a few years ago, and I wrote about it too.
Rotem, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. If you're trying to transition slides, they haven't been moving, but you might just be on the same one. Also, we see the presentation mode, but it doesn't look like it's in presentation mode for the slides.
That's strange. Thanks for saying that. Let's see, am I not sharing the correct thing? Okay, can you see different slides now?
Yep, that's perfect.
Sweet, thanks so much, Merrick.
Yep.
Cool, so as I was saying, there's a way to practice open science that will essentially, I can't say that it'll ensure that the science we do now will stand the test of time, but it'll much increase it. And I think it's also important that we do open science because ultimately our results belong to the public. We're funded by the public, and the public are the people who are actually participating in our studies. So we feel strongly that it is important that the public has access to what we find. So just in a word, what we do is we share our data openly. So everything, all of our original data sets are available, and you can find them online. There will be a link at the very end of my slides. And then also our materials. So the way we tested things, you can also find those online. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we pre-register everything. So before we even start doing the research, we say, okay, this is what we think we're going to find. This is how we're going to study it. And we then report everything that we said we would, and we don't hide inconvenient findings, and we don't go fishing for stuff that we didn't necessarily think we would find. We think this is, and I think that this is all very, very important. So just to tell you about how we collected our data, the data I'll be presenting is from two online surveys. We used social media, Twitter, Facebook, a bunch of Reddit posts, and just word of mouth to get to as many participants as we could. And then I'll show you what we found. The first study I'm going to talk about is the Global Drug Survey. It's been pre-registered. You can find it on the website that's at the top right, and I'll also show this website at the end of my slides. But yeah, we had a lot of participants, right? We had what I think altogether the survey had something like 120,000 participants, out of which 6,753 people reported having microdosed in the last 12 months. And people mostly said that they were microdosing LSD. It's unsurprising, and this actually replicates our findings from a previous survey. It's likely because LSD is easier to come by, and it may also be because it's easier to titrate and figure out your dose, but I'm not sure about that. This is what we have, this is information we have. And then we were also curious about whether or not people test their substances. And we found that generally, more people reported testing their substances more than what we expected. So almost half of people for both magic mushrooms and LSD is in the next slide, said that they test their substances. But still more than half said that they don't test their substances. I don't find it particularly surprising. I think that these are not substances that are normally laced with anything. And, you know, in the case of LSD, you're taking such a tiny dose that even if someone replaced, 100 micrograms of LSD with 100 micrograms of a relatively toxic compound, you would probably still be fine. And in the case of mushrooms, someone would have to really mean you harm to either give you poison mushrooms or put poison in your mushrooms. I think that it's extremely important, nonetheless, to test the substances you're using, especially if they're black market and you don't know where they're coming from. It's more that I'm trying to kind of understand how come people didn't test their substances. And then I want to show you a comparison of reported benefits that people had from microdosing compared to previous work that we did. So in our previous work, this is what you see on the left. We had a sample size of 807 people that responded to saying what the reported benefits were. And then this is from the Global Drug Survey. For this question, we had a lot of responses. And I think that overall, you can see that the three main benefits remained more or less the same. There's some difference, like you can see on the right, improved mood for the larger sample is much smaller. It's roughly half the amount of people that reported that. But still, mostly people report microdosing helps with improved mood, enhanced creativity, and improved energy. Okay, so those results more or less replicated. We can be a little more confident that that is indeed the case. In terms of challenges associated with microdosing, which I think is also extremely important to measure, in our previous sample, we had the vast majority of people said that the largest drawback of microdosing is that it is illegal. And that's, you know, not an issue of the substance itself, but rather public policy. And then physiological discomfort was also reported, including things like having trouble sleeping, feeling hot or cold, that kind of thing. And this is our sample from the Global Drug Survey. And you can see that the legal consequences were not as significant a concern in the second study. And it may be that some time has passed between those two samples, about 2 years. And so maybe microdosing has become more widely accepted. Maybe the Global Drug Survey contains a different kind of population, but it appears that legal consequences were not such a big thing. But physiological discomfort replicated quite a bit. And then you can see for yourself other things like impaired focus and mental confusion are similar. I think it's also important, some people may have already noticed that there's some parallels between the challenges and the benefits. So for example, you can see there's increased anxiety here, but there's also reduced anxiety here. And you see similar things for improved mood here, but there's also negative mood here. So what's going on? Well, we don't know is the short answer. This could be due to a difference in set and setting. So for some people, if the set and setting are right, then they get a boost in mood and reduced anxiety. And for some people, the set and setting were wrong. It may be that there are different, individual differences between people and how they experience it. It's hard to say, but these are our findings. And we also asked people why they microdose. And the largest proportion was people who were just curious. They were just curious to see what microdosing is about. And then you see also people were doing it to improve their mood, to enhance their creativity, and to enhance their productivity. So a lot of the same stuff. Finally, I hypothesized that there would be a connection between the intention to microdose and the benefits derived from microdosing. And this is also based on theories by others. So Jim Fadiman has said in the past that it's likely that if you lean into the experience, you're gonna get better results, right? This is kind of like Psychedelics 101. Everyone knows that you gotta lean into it and not try and avoid it. So the way we tried to compare it is we asked people, why did you start microdosing? And we tried to compare between approach and avoid motivations. So an example for an approach motivation is to improve mood and or overall life satisfaction. And an example of an avoid motivation is to escape negative feelings like depression and anxiety. And counter to what we hypothesized, what we found is that avoidance was actually predictive of more benefits than approach. And this could be for a variety of reasons. For example, it's possible that negative things have more of a downstream effect. And so when you resolve them, suddenly your whole life improves by a lot. I think that that we need to do more research on this and figure it out, because this was quite the surprising finding. I can talk more about my theories about why we found this, maybe if we have time at the end. But still, I think that this is an interesting finding, so I definitely wanted to present that. And then the second study that I want to talk to you about, the qualitative analysis, is just we had 118 unstructured qualitative responses. And the four main themes emerged. One is reasons for microdosing. So why do people microdose? I'll talk a lot more about this in a minute. And then the very practice of microdosing, what it's like to microdose. This is just an example, the first that I came across. Someone who didn't benefit from microdosing. And then there's the outcomes of microdosing, what people got out of it, and meta commentary on microdosing. A lot of it is either people should really try it or people should do more research on it. But the interesting thing that we discovered is that there were two main narratives in terms of reasons to microdose. Some people wanted to flourish. They were fine and they wanted to get even better. And some people were feeling down, depressed or unwell in other ways, and they wanted to improve their symptoms. And that led people to microdose in general. So an example for a flourishing narrative is someone who's tried prescription study drugs and they kind of worked, but microdosing is better for them. Or this person who's been depressed for their entire adolescence, SSRIs didn't help with their depression, but with microdosing, they felt like all of a sudden they're not depressed for the first time ever. That's cool, and it makes sense. To me, what was really cool is that we actually found that, sure, people who approached it from a flourishing narrative, some of them got improved performance, and some people that approached it from a clinical perspective got alleviation of clinical symptoms. But everyone reported this theme of connectedness. And it feels like people who approached it with a clinical perspective still got a flourishing aspect, and people who approached it from a flourishing aspect still got a little bit of a clinical boost. So for example, Hazel said, while microdosing, you have a broader perspective and little problems don't worry you. So sure, this is kind of like her performance would be better, and she got a wider perspective, and this is like a feeling of connectedness to the broad world. Whereas Stella, that didn't know she was depressed before, she got more of a connectedness to herself. So this is kind of interesting. I think it may be related to what was going on before with the benefits. I think this may have to do with how microdosing enhances psychological flexibility. But I'm running out of time, and I want to quickly tell you about the future directions. We will soon start a microdosing trial that will be a crossover washout design, meaning that we'll have two groups, and one will start with placebo, and then halfway through, it'll switch to psilocybin. The other will start with psilocybin, halfway through the study, they'll switch to placebo, and that way we can figure out how long it takes for benefits to kick in, how long it takes them to wash out. We'll measure a bunch of things, including mood, engagement, mindfulness, etc. A lot of interesting stuff. And yeah, I want to say thanks very much to my collaborators, Norman Farb, Thomas Anderson, Adam Winstock from the Global Drug Survey, Daniel Rosenbaum, Corey Weissman, and Jin-Sun Kim, who helped a lot in this whole process. Yeah, so that's me. And feel free to check out our Open Science Framework profile, check out our website, get in touch. Happy to chat.
Hey, Rotem, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Some really, really interesting findings. And I'd love to start it off there. Could you give us some perspectives on, especially stepping in and avoidance? Why do you think that y'all might have gotten results like that that seem, so counterintuitive to what the space has currently, currently kind of, had its opinion on?
For sure. So just to kind of expand more on what I was saying before, here's an example. If an approach motivation would have been I want to have better health behaviors, and an avoidance motivation would be I want to have less substance use disorder, then it's much easier to gauge whether or not you use other substances less and the impact that it's had on your life. Whereas if you're just trying to improve, your metric is probably a little more vague and it's hard to assess. I think that it's also really important to say, we may have measured it poorly. This was on a survey. We tried to make it as quick as possible because people were volunteering their time. So it may be our measurement is unreliable. And it may be that our theory is, like, the way we framed it is not great either. I'm only somewhat, I think that we need to replicate these findings for me to really believe them and be confident about them. Because, like you say, it really flies in the face of the current theory we have about how psychedelics work.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Some of the conversations we've had before is kind of at the intersection of research and industry, and so many individuals are interested in kind of the industry-focused prospects of something like microdosing. It has a really compelling economic model for folks, and is one of the fastest things that you can bring to market, kind of as a consumer packaged good. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what research will we need to see for yourself to be significantly more confident in microdosing kind of entering the public space, the public domain, or do you feel like we're already ready for it and it's time for us to kind of bring microdosing to the masses?
I think that's an excellent question because there's a lot we still don't know about microdosing, especially long-term. There have been these recurrent concerns about the cardiotoxicity of 5-HT2B agonists. So I think that's one thing that we definitely need to look for before we make this totally legal, because we definitely don't want people to experience any kind of serious health concerns following their use of psychedelics. I think that in order to convince policymakers, we would probably have to, run a few proper clinical trials that are randomly controlled and that are ideally pre-registered, so that we're absolutely confident that it's not that the researchers are motivated to get a certain set of findings, but rather that they're honestly reporting everything.
Sorry, apologies, was on mute. I'd also love to hear a little bit more specifically about open science. I know that it's something that you are constantly advocating for, and it's something that I think the space is trying to really embrace. And with all of these for-profit players coming in and looking at specifically patents and intellectual property around psychedelics, I was hoping you could talk about some of the consequences you think that for-profits will bring in regards to the ability for open science to flourish in the psychedelics ecosystem, and the ramifications on the field possibly over the next 10 years as a result of that.
That's kind of, that's a lot. And promise to, I don't know that I have the capacity to respond to that. And like, this isn't my area of expertise, right? I can talk about science. Mm-hmm. And it's a good question because I recently, a few months ago, started working with a company called Psyched, and this is after a lot of other companies reached out to me and wanted to work together. And I said, I'm happy to do the research that I'm doing as long as I get to share everything. So that as long as you support open science, I'm happy to work together. Mm-hmm. And most companies that have, like, this was an ongoing process. A lot of companies were absolutely turned off by the prospect of sharing what they discover with the general population, even with the scientific community. Mm-hmm. I think that it could be tricky to find a way that open science could work with the industry, especially if the industry is aiming to profit from specific kinds of intellectual property. At the same time, I think that, for example, Psyched have found ways to do that. And so I think that it's not impossible. It would just require, on one hand, I think it would require that scientists do not give up their integrity and put science first. And then I think it'll essentially force the hand of for-profit companies to find ways to make that work.
Would you mind explaining what that process looks like? If that's not something you're comfortable sharing, that's completely fine as well.
Like which process?
Specifically with Psyched in regards to how they treat the research that you're publishing, how they're able to take advantage of it and still allow for you to align with open science.
Yeah, for sure. So we actually took a page. So I can't really, I don't feel super comfortable talking about, you know, all of the arrangements I have with them, just because
Definitely.
I know how they would feel about that. But we basically took a page from how the University of Toronto deals with sponsored research. And since Psyched are sponsoring some of our research, we're happy to kind of, you know, we let them look at our research before it's published. But I think that's well within what makes sense. And it's not like, you know, they have the research for 5 years before we publish it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that this gives them, a way to still have some benefit that's more or less exclusive to them.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I'd love to hear also the thoughts on collaborations with other research centers in the space. One of the things you mentioned is, you know, science keeping their integrity. Do you feel like, you know, this wave that's coming just from maybe what you felt over this last year as for-profits have entered this space, do you feel like the, ethos of collaboration is increasing or decreasing between different psychedelic centers and psychedelic researchers in the space?
Overall, I would say that to me, it feels like people are trying to carve out a name for themselves right now. And to me, it feels like people are not super excited about collaborating. I actually saw someone like my perspective, I love collaborating. I want to work with everyone. And I think that everyone would be better off by that. And I also think that another important part of practicing open science is replicating your own work and having other people replicate your work to make sure that it all makes sense. And so whenever I see anyone that's doing work that's related to mine, I reach out to them and I'm like, hey, is there any way I can help? I'm not looking for, you know, accolades. I don't want to be co-author on your paper. Just wondering if there's anything you need help with. And some people have been absolutely great about it. And I think some people, I don't know, maybe they suspect ulterior motives. And maybe, you know, they're just fine the way they are. But I think for sure some people are more focusing on competition than cooperation right now.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. That idea of carving out your own space in this field of research, it seems like, you know, there's so many things that are left to be discovered, you know, and we're just really in day zero, day one. Do you have any thoughts on why that kind of rush might be happening?
I agree with you 100% that there's so much to be discovered. There's room for everyone and then some. So it's hard for me to really get why people are being like this. And yeah, I think it's the word you used, rush. I think there's something of a gold rush right now and everyone feels like they may be missing out on something. So they're trying to be the, you know, that person who's an expert on this or that. Definitely.
Well, Rotem, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for your insights. Really incredible research, really incredible work. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.